Hello and welcome back to our study on the great 19th century philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. This is our 14th study already on SK. By the time we're done, we're going to have probably, I would say, between 30, 40, maybe 50 studies. I don't know. It just depends on how far we want to get into the great Christian theologian, Lutheran philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. It's based on my book called Soren Kierkegaard, Night of Infinite Resignation. There's the cover right there. You can buy it on Amazon.com. Hopefully you have a copy and you can follow along as we go through the whole book. Our study began at St. Paul's Lutheran Church back in October of 2010. And some of the people who were in the study said that there needed to be a deeper explanation of the book to understand SK. And so that's why I decided to put this on the internet, on YouTube. And so we're going to continue today with the 14th study. And in this study, we're continuing on page 139 on the interlude. The interlude is an episode in the fragments that analyzes the question as to whether the contemporary of Jesus Christ had a greater advantage than the subsequent disciple, like ourselves. And, in other words, did St. Peter, did John the Baptist, did Mary Magdalene, did Mary, the Mother of God, herself have a greater advantage than the subsequent disciple, such as myself, for example, who came to a knowledge of Christianity when I was 24. So did these initial disciples and followers of Christ have a greater advantage? So that's what this whole analysis is all about. And he uses this as an occasion to analyze history and necessity, because it was a big issue in Kierkegaard's time, as everybody knows. In the philosophy of Hegel, and ultimately in the philosophy of Karl Marx, dialectical materialism, in which he thought he had understood the necessity in history. So he really is using this as an occasion to analyze a lot of the thinking, the thinking that went into philosophy in the 19th century. So we left off at 139, and SK observes that everything that comes into existence becomes historical. This is true in nature as well as history. There is a difference, however, in the coming into existence in the historical, in the sense of history, and history in the sense of nature, because in the strictly historical coming into existence, such as the coming into existence of the plan and the mind of Napoleon, is different from the coming into existence of nature. The coming into existence of a plan, such as in the plan of Napoleon to take over the world and all that, that has a secondary coming into existence. But in nature, there's only one coming into existence, because there is no other coming into existence. Because there's no plan, nature has no idea within itself to have any other possibility. So I try to give a brief explanation of what this means in terms of language. Maybe we can better understand. And I do this on page 140 here. Page 140. So here's how I try to explain what seems to be pretty complicated coming into existence and necessity. All things that happen in existence require two things, idea and will. Let's use the example of Napoleon, as Kierkegaard was wont to do. The absolutely freely affecting cause that brought Napoleon into existence was God's idea and will. Napoleon, after having come into existence in turn, was given by God a relatively freely affecting will. It was this will that worked its way through Europe and tried to create a French empire. The second coming into existence is what Kierkegaard is referring to. Nature itself has only one coming into existence, since nature has no idea or will to affect anything else. Now, the past has become history and therefore, when it becomes history, it becomes immutable by the fact that it cannot be undone. You can't go back and change the past. Even if you had a time machine, you can't do it. It's not possible. You can change the future via a time machine, but you can't change the past. The past has become immutable by the fact that it cannot be undone. The past, in other words, cannot be changed. It doesn't matter whether it was a day ago or a century ago, because the past is past and cannot be changed. The past tends to, and because of this fact, the past tends to give the illusion to historical knowledge that the past somehow happened by some sort of necessity. However, when one reflects upon coming into existence, that which came into existence in the past proved by coming into existence that it was not necessary. So the historian really, when he looks back at the past and tries to understand what the past was all about, is really a prophet in retrospect, or a historian is really a prophet, so to speak, of the past, in which he can only speculate upon how it came into existence, in the same way that a prophet of the future speculates what the future will be. Whoever apprehends the past, historico-philosophus, is therefore a prophet in retrospect. That is, he is a prophet who expresses that he is a prophet expresses the fact that the certainty of the past is based upon an uncertainty. So it's all speculation about how the past came about, whether it was the greatest exploits of a king or whether it was his lowliest servant that changed everything. Speculation. It's open to doubt. Nobody really knows. God knows, but no one else knows. S.K.'s skepticism was thoroughly Greek in nature. The Greek skeptic did not doubt by virtue of his knowledge, but by an act of will. Refusal to give assent. Therefore, doubt can only be overcome by an act of will. Hence, the skeptic keeps his mind constantly in suspense, and it was his frame of mind he willed to maintain. It was not the result of a process of thinking, as in Hegelian thought, but rather in the will to believe in what his sense perception told him, and the will not to believe. So here we see the application that Kierkegaard applies to epistemology with respect to history, and that ultimately truth is based on a will to believe or a will not to believe, and not on a logical construction that brings a proof. The proof comes by a will. Do I will to believe it, or do I not will to believe it? In this case, the history of the past. With these observations in mind, Climacus returns to his theme that the god came to teach the learner in time. With respect to ordinary historical knowledge, both the contemporary witness and the witness at secondhand are confronted with the immediacy of sensory perception. The first as a witness of the event itself, and the second as a witness to a contemporary's accounting of the event. But here, once again, did it actually happen? In the same conflict with the contemporary of Jesus Christ and the disciple at second hand, third hand, fourth hand, and now in the 21st century, 21st hand, the question, did it happen? And how and thus of why it happened. The past did not become necessary by any certain logical construction that we can think of, because anything that comes into being proves by coming into it being that it is not necessary, as we've said before. Since the necessary always relates to itself in the same way without change. The immutability of the necessary, on the contrary, consists in the constant relating itself to itself, and in the relating itself to itself always in the same manner, excluding every change. Okay, once again, you get the highly philosophical, metaphysical explanation of what necessary is. Necessary is something that cannot change because it's necessary. If it changes, it's not necessary. Now, this goes back to a lot of the scholastic theologians and how they looked at necessity and history. And so I go into a commentary on SK's analysis, and I go back to Luther's analysis and Bondage of the Will and the scholastic idea of necessity and history. And I hate to bring up two theologians against each other, but what Luther would say is, yes, of course, necessity does not change, it cannot change, but all that really proves in the end that it is not God, that the only thing that's necessary is God. And all that proves is what changes is not God. And that's true. The only thing that's absolutely necessary is God. So I go into a deep analysis on 143. And this is my own commentary on Johannes Climacus' interlude. And all of JC's arguments are reminiscent of the scholastic theologians of the Middle Ages and the same arguments that Erasmus used in his controversy with Luther. See, as Luther would say, I am sure, Climacus's analysis is perfectly correct when it comes to immanence, or that is, from man's point of view. Nothing comes into existence by necessity. Man's foreknowledge does not impose any necessity. All this is true from man's point of view, but not from God's point of view. From God's point of view, all things happen by pure necessity. And even Luther said that Christians can take a great deal of comfort from this, because everything to happen, happens to us, either good, bad, or indifferent, comes into existence by God's ultimate plan for existence. The unfolding of God's idea from all of eternity. And I put in some personal notes and observations. When I look up at the sway and motion of leaves in the trees in the park across from my office, where I'm writing this current book, and right now I'm making this commentary, this video, right here from my office across from a park right across the street. When I look up at the sway and motion of leaves in the trees in the parks across my street, I know the sway and motion was ordained by God from all of eternity. When I see a little tiny cloud across the street and across the sky, I know it was ordained by God to do this from all of eternity. When great tumults and controversies and wars take place, this too was ordained from God. This means that no one or anything in heaven and earth has a free will except God. Now, we're really getting into deep theology. And some people are going to be offended, and that's understandable. And I don't push these ideas necessarily on people. People can decide on their own minds what really is the omnipotence of God and what free will does man actually have. Now I go back to Luther and Bondage of the Will and how he proved the omnipotence, the predestination of everything through his foreknowledge. And if any creature in heaven and earth were to be given a free will, then God would not be omnipotent, but God would have ceded his omnipotent power to other beings, so that we would have to forget the doctrine of the church concerning God's omnipotence, and the Almighty Father would become a demigod instead of an absolute God. Now, I go constantly back to Luther's proof of the predestination of everything. It's going to surprise people that Luther believed this and taught it in Bondage of the Will, because it's primarily associated with Calvin, but there are a lot of distinctions we have to make later. Luther's proof of the omnipotence and immutability of God's will, in which Luther gives prima facie proof of God's governance over everything that happens, comes into being, or changes its nature in being. If we assume, here's Luther's proof. I've studied it a long time in Bondage. If we assume that God is immutable in everything, then we must also assume that he is immutable in his foreknowledge. But he could not be immutable in his foreknowledge unless he predestined the occurrence of everything in existence. Because it is only an omnipotent God that can ensure the immutability of his foreknowledge. In other words, immutability, omniscience, omnipotence all work together. You can't have one without the other. So that creates a lot of problems in theology, because, as Luther once said, it's almost like there's two gods. I mean, you got a God of mercy and forgiveness and love, and then you got a God who works everything according to the purpose of his will. Thessalonians 1, I think it's Thessalonians 1:11, according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the purpose of his will. So, reconciling those two things are pretty darn difficult. And, Luther had a tremendous amount of struggle with these, and We're not going to solve them in this book. It's getting a little bit late. Okay, it's past my bedtime right now. Oh, well, anyway. So the word immutable means in Latin that it cannot happen otherwise. In other words, it has to happen. Immutable means it has to happen the way God foreknew it. And in bondage, this is the way Luther describes this whole problem of the predestination of God, the immutability, and how everything comes into existence by pure necessity. Now, the difference I have with the interlude in the fragments is that SK is looking at it from the human point of view, and of course, that's true. Nothing comes into existence by man's will, but it does come into existence by God's will, in which everything happens by absolute necessity. But does this mean that there is no free will in man? Well, I did a search in the Bible a couple of years ago in the New Testament. There are actually two places where the Bible speaks about man's free will. And certainly there is an aspect of free will in man, but that doesn't mean, but God's predestination and man's free will are not mutually contrary. They're not necessarily opposed to each other, because God can predestine things and still man can have a certain amount of free will. How much free will? That's another question. Where does God's omnipotence leave off and man's free will begins? Well, that's a really difficult question. I don't think any theologian or philosopher will ever be able to explain that, but there is free will in man. Man does make decisions according to God's gifts that he gives him, but he predestines it directly or indirectly. So take that or leave that as you may. I don't impose my views on anyone. There are a lot of different views throughout Christian theology, all the way from the Pelagian view that man can earn his own forgiveness, his own eternal salvation, the semi-Pelagian view, and then you have sort of a providential view of God, which is more or less my view. And then you have the absolute predestinarian view of someone like Calvin, a naked predestinarian point of view. So we've got all those to choose from. I think Luther was right, and I would categorize Luther as somewhere between the providential idea of God's predestination and his absolute predestinarian view of someone like Calvin. But the thing about, see, here's what I want to say about Luther and in this view, and why, Luther, the Lutheran Church ultimately rejected Luther's view, as everyone knows, in the later on in the Formula of Concord on predestination. But what you have to know is that you've got to take Luther as a whole. I mean, he moderated some of his views. He did not change them later on, but he moderated some of his views in his Genesis lectures. And you have to understand Luther, that Luther painted with a broad brush stroke. And the perfect example of this is when he called the book of James the straw epistle. Well, that was Luther, and that wasn't his full view of the book of James. He highly admired the book of James, but that one passage that a man is not justified by faith alone, but also by works. He had to therefore classify James in a lower category than the rest of Scripture, like the works of St. Paul. So it's very important to understand Luther in the whole context, because later on in the Augsburg Confession, he admitted there is an aspect of free will in man, and so it's a question that we need to contemplate. We'll never answer, I don't think, but God does predestine, and at the same time there is free will in man. So I like to summarize it in this way, and we have about 4 minutes. In his hidden will, in other words, his omnipotent will, God predestines everything, good, evil, or indifferent. It doesn't matter. This is how Luther described the hidden will of God. Here is something fundamentally necessary and salutary for a Christian to know, that God foreknows nothing contingently, but that he foresees and purposes and does all things by his immutable, eternal, and infallible will. This position of Luther's was one of the charges against him at the Diet of Worms. It was also a position of Spinoza, and that was also condemned by the church. But Luther cautions very, very strongly that one is not to try to understand God in the hidden will. And this is how Luther explains it. This is the first stage of error, when men disregard God as he has enveloped himself and become incarnate, and seek to scrutinize the unveiled God. Later on, when the hour of judgment arrives and they feel the wrath of God, when God is judging and investigating their hearts, then the devil ceases to puff them up, and they despair and die. For they are walking unsheltered in the sun and are abandoning the shade, which gives them relief. In this he quotes Isaiah 4:6. Let no one therefore contemplate the unveiled divinity, but let him flee from these contemplations as from hell and the veritable temptations. And this is in Martin Luther's collected works, Bondage of the Will, volume 39, page 165, in the Concordia Publishing House. Concordia edition of the works of Martin Luther. And the hidden will is revealed also, I would say, in the Old Testament. And it's in the passage in Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the words of his law. So there is this hidden will, and there is the will that is revealed to us and how we relate to God, because there are things above our heads that are infinitely above us, just as the heavens are above the earth, as it says in the Old Testament. The ways of God are as high above the earth as the heavens are, or the ways of God are as high above our understanding as the heavens are above the earth. So, okay, that's going to do it for this study, and we've ended up on page 146. It's getting late tonight, and hopefully we'll get up and start again tomorrow on 146 and go on. And thanks for attending, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.